The Minnesota Vikings have had a very busy offseason thus far. However, with a lot of anticipation that they're going to be taking a quarterback in this year's draft, today let's discuss the Minnesota Vikings and their upcoming future. So as I mentioned, the Minnesota Vikings have been extremely busy thus far this offseason. With that being said, I still have a couple concerns. However, this team is definitely trending in the right direction. Let's start off with what they've done this past free agency because it's been pretty hectic. They started off by bringing in Jonathan Grenard on a pretty nice sized contract. They brought him in on a 4-year $76 million deal with $42 million being fully guaranteed. I like this deal a lot. Jonathan Grenard was a very busy player last year for the Houston Texans. He had 12.5 sacks, 15 tackles for loss, and 22 quarterback hits. He's only 26 years old and he seems to be the replacement for Danielle Hunter. Now, I do believe Danielle Hunter is a better player right now. However, Jonathan Grenard does offer a lot more versatility on both sides of the defensive line, as well as being a younger player. So I do think this is a good signing and a very quality replacement for Danielle Hunter. Then this Vikings team really upgraded their linebacker position with both Blake Cashman and Andrew Van Ginkel. We'll start off with Andrew Van Ginkel, who was actually drafted by Brian Flores all the way back with the Miami Dolphins in 2019. Van Ginkel is a very good player who last year had a career-high 6 sacks for the Miami Dolphins. Now he joins this Minnesota Vikings team, which is a team that could honestly use production from the linebacker position from a guy like Andrew Van Ginkel. He's been around the league for quite some time, obviously drafted in 2019, has been a very productive player for his entire career, and now he's joining Brian Flores again with the Minnesota Vikings. Again, the Vikings did need to dramatically improve the linebacking room, and bringing in Andrew Van Ginkel on a pretty cheap deal, in my opinion, is completely worth it. Then they brought in Blake Cashman on a 3-year deal worth $22.5 million. I really freaking like this move. For starters, last year Blake Cashman was uber productive. Last year he had 68 solo tackles, 33 assisted tackles, and 1 interception. And when you look at his PFF grades, he was fantastic. He had a run stuff grade of 84.7, a pass rush grade of 73.5, a coverage grade of 75.4, and an overall PFF grade of an 83.7. Last year, he was one of the most productive players in this Houston Texans defense, and now he's going to a Minnesota Vikings team where he's probably going to be playing a very similar role to what he did in Houston. He's going to be asked to do a lot of the dirty work the Minnesota Vikings team needs. Blake Cashman is going to be productive, and bringing him in on a very cheap contract, in my opinion, was completely worth it. He's young, he's productive, and he's just now starting to get his legs going in the NFL. I really like this move for the Minnesota Vikings, and I think their linebacking room, low-key, is one of the better units in the NFL. Next up, let's talk about Aaron Jones, who left the Green Bay Packers to go to the Minnesota Vikings on a 1-year deal. We all know the productivity that Aaron Jones has been able to do in the NFL for quite some time. He's one of the best running backs in the league, and he's very versatile, being both a very good pure running back and a very good receiving back as well. Last year, despite some injuries, he still had almost 700 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. Throughout his entire career, he almost has 6,000 rushing yards, and he's entering that age where he's getting to the point where he's not as productive as a player as he used to be. However, after the Minnesota Vikings had a horrible year running the ball last year behind Alexander Mattison, Aaron Jones is a clear upgrade over him. I anticipate Aaron Jones will likely have close to 1,000 rushing yards and will probably be even more productive in the pass game than a guy like Alexander Mattison was for them last year. This is a Minnesota Vikings team that already has a very solid offensive line. You now bring in a very competent running back behind that offensive line. I expect him to have a very productive season. Hopefully this team can add a future quarterback to alleviate some of the pressure off Aaron Jones. I would also be interested to see if this Vikings team does go out there and try to get a younger running back in the draft like a Jonathan Brooks or a Trey Benson to be the future back for the long-term future. Then they brought in a couple other players like Jonathan Bullard, Jerry Tillery, Trent Sherfield, Dan Feeney, Shaq Griffin, and Camu Grugier-Hill. All these guys have been playing for quite some time. They're all productive players in their own way. However, none of those guys, in my opinion, are full-time starters. You're not getting a big impact player with any of those guys. Maybe Brandon Powell a tad bit as like your punt returner, but most of those additions were more of depth options. But of course, in an offseason, you're going to want to go out there and do that, so it makes a ton of sense. I am interested to see if Shaquille Griffin can kind of pick his feet off the ground. He's sort of fallen off a cliff ever since he's left some of the teams he used to be on. He used to be a very good corner, but now has sort of been limited on what he's been able to do. It seems like he's kind of falling off a little bit, so hopefully for Minnesota, they can bring back his productivity. But now we get to the interesting stuff, the quarterback conversation. The Minnesota Vikings just brought in quarterback Sam Darnold, the former number 3 overall pick of the 2018 NFL Draft. They bring him in on a 1-year deal, and it appears that he's going to be the starting quarterback for this team next year, at least on the surface. However, despite the scenes, this team has been very active in trying to get even more draft picks to what I believe to move up in the draft to get a quarterback. As it sits right now, the Minnesota Vikings have 2 first-round picks after trading back with the Houston Texans to acquire pick number 23. What the Minnesota Vikings were able to do in this trade was they got the number 23 overall pick and the number 232, which is a 7th round pick, and the Houston Texans in return got pick number 42, which is a 2nd round pick number 188 and a second round pick in 2025, essentially saying the Minnesota Vikings are all in to try to move up. There would be no other reason for this team to get 2 first-round picks other than if they wanted to make the trade up to try to get a quarterback. It seems to me like the Sam Darnold move was more as a mentorship-like role, so that when they do acquire, hopefully, a Drake May or a JJ McCarthy, we'll talk about who I would prefer for this team in just a second, but it does appear like Sam Darnold is going to be potentially the starter for a couple weeks and then eventually be replaced if he doesn't perform well, or it's a situation where Sam Darnold plays the entire season as a starter, and then as the contract expires, they're going to move on to the younger quarterback that they draft this year. But now let's actually discuss which quarterback I think would be the best fit for the Minnesota Vikings, and let's also talk about what they might have to give up in a potential trade up. For starters, the number 1 pick and in my opinion the number 2 overall pick are completely off limits. It is very obvious the Bears are going to take Caleb Williams, and it is very obvious the Commanders are going to take either Jaden Daniels or Drake May. So if you are the Minnesota Vikings, you're looking at pick number 3, or in my opinion pick number 5, which belongs to the LA Chargers. Pick number 3 belongs to the New England Patriots, and as it sits right now, the Patriots do need to take a quarterback this year. However, they could also be interested in sort of tanking this year to get a quarterback next year. If you're New England, which is a team that needs a lot of picks and needs a lot of things to fill on their roster, getting pick number 11 and 23 and potentially even more draft capital would make a ton of sense. Hypothetically, for the Patriots, you could take an offensive tackle and a wide receiver with this year's draft because it is a loaded tackle and receiver class, and then maybe get a Michael Penix or a Spencer Rattler in the 2nd and 3rd round if they're somehow still available. If not, you could just keep stacking players on your roster and then next year take the quarterback. Minnesota would get the number 3 overall pick and likely take one of Jaden Daniels and Drake May. However, if New England is not willing to cooperate, again, I think the LA Chargers are probably your next likely team to trade up with. They have pick number 5, and they also have a lot of holes on their roster, mainly offensive tackle and wide receiver, similar to the New England Patriots. Same thing sort of applies for the LA Chargers. If they get pick 11 and 23, they can take an offensive tackle and a wide receiver to really fix up a lot of their roster. This is a Chargers team that is probably more willing to trade back because they already have their franchise quarterback in Justin Herbert. The one thing I will say with the Minnesota Vikings in this situation is if you do end up with pick number 5, you're likely going to be forced to take JJ McCarthy. And I'm not the biggest JJ McCarthy supporter, but I'm also not a big denier of JJ McCarthy. Some people think he's not even worth a 2nd round pick. That's complete bogus in my opinion. However, I don't think he's worth a top 5 pick. I'd feel comfortable taking him at pick 11. However, trading up and trading a ton of assets to move up to number 5 to get JJ McCarthy, to me, seems a little rich. Like, I ask you guys this right now, is JJ McCarthy better than Jared Goff, Jordan Love, or going to be Caleb Williams? Probably not, and I don't really foresee his career ever being to the same standard as those guys, which would mean that you're banking on him developing and really turning into a franchise level quarterback in a division that already has a ton of really good quarterbacks. By the way, we'll talk about this division here in a little bit because that also goes against the Minnesota Vikings as well. So for me, in my opinion, I would rather them just trade up to pick number 3 and hope that the Patriots are going to be willing to talk and negotiate. If you can end up getting a Drake May or a Jaden Daniels, those guys have clearly a ton more potential to be a top 10 quarterback than JJ McCarthy does right now. That's not me saying that JJ McCarthy can't be a top 15 quarterback or can't be better than a Jared Goff or a Jordan Love. It's just based off everything I've seen, I don't feel as confident in him as I do with a Drake May or a Jaden Daniels. So that being said, I would clearly like the Minnesota Vikings to move up to pick number 3 and guarantee your spot in Jaden Daniels or Drake May over a guy like JJ McCarthy with pick number 5, or hell, maybe if he falls to pick number 11, then you can take him there, but I don't like it. But we could even be in a situation where potentially Minnesota can't trade up at all and they're forced to just take their pick number 11 and pick number 23. If that's the case, I don't really hate that idea either. This is one of the better draft classes that we've seen in quite some time, so if I was them, staying at both those spots and being able to address different positions isn't the worst idea ever. This is a team that could really use a top tier corner or a top tier pass rusher or even a top tier interior offense alignment, mainly at that left guard position. Hypothetically, in this situation, maybe you go out there with pick number 11 and take a Jared Verse or a Quinion Mitchell, and then with your 2nd round pick, you address another problem. Yes, you still have a hole at quarterback, but you're banking on the fact that Sam Darnold could be a decent quarterback next year, which I think he can be with this roster. And then you'd be building an even better roster so that next year when you take that quarterback, you're going to be even better for it. With that being said though, I would take most of the quarterbacks in this year's draft over what is probably going to be coming out next year. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of Quinn Ewers or Carson Beck or Shedeur Sanders. I would probably still take JJ McCarthy over those guys. Maybe you could debate on the Shedeur Sanders and the Quinn Ewers one, but again, we're talking about upside here. And given the fact that you just traded your 2nd round pick for next year, it's more than likely that you're going to have to go all in this year. So I think the likelihood of that happening is pretty much not going to happen. It's more than likely they're going to trade up for a quarterback, whether that is a JJ McCarthy or a Jaden Daniels / Drake May. Again, if you're asking me, I really like Drake May on this roster. I think he'd be that perfect perfect fit alongside guys like Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. He's a guy who I think can contend now while also still being able to develop into that top 5 quarterback that we think he can be in this league. Drake May has Justin Herbert, Josh Allen like upside, and if you can get that with this roster, this team is good. But now let's actually talk about the competition within the division, because this is arguably one of the most competitive divisions moving forward. Let's get this out of the way. Yes, the Chicago Bears are going to be good next year. They have a good, competent roster, and they seem to be heading in the right direction. With Caleb Williams hopefully being the franchise quarterback, that team is deadly, and I do think they are a true contender in that division. Maybe not next year, but within the next couple of years. Then you have the Green Bay Packers, who I think they have their own little set of problems. However, bringing in Xavier McKinney does fill in a lot of problems on that secondary. You also still have Jordan Love. You also brought in Josh Jacobs. That team is going to be better next year than they were this year. Then, of course, you have the Detroit Lions, who obviously won the division last year, made it to the NFC Championship game, arguably should have won that game and would have made it to a Super Bowl. That's a Lions team that is very, very legit, and they're only going to get better this year. Now you're looking at the Minnesota Vikings. You have 3 teams who all realistically can make a playoff spot next year, and you're going to have to try to compete with them this year. You're also going to be in a situation where Chicago's going to get the best quarterback of this draft in Caleb Williams, so you're going to end up having to hopefully get a Drake May or a Jaden Daniels. If not, AJ McCarthy does feel like a pretty big drop off after Caleb Williams. Again, this is a division that is going to continue to get better, and if you look at those rosters, they're all really freaking good. Like, Chicago has arguably a top 5 defense in that conference. Green Bay has an offense that is capable of being very dominant every single game, and then Detroit is just a very balanced roster with a very, very good run game, and they're also very young, which goes for every single team. All those teams are very young as well. So for the Minnesota Vikings, I like what they did this offseason, and I think they've positioned themselves quite nicely within this division. However, the big question is going to be who they get at quarterback and whether or not that quarterback can develop to be one of the best quarterbacks in that division. But you guys tell me, what have you guys thought about the Minnesota Vikings offseason thus far? Do you think they're heading in the right direction? And do you think this team with a Drake May or a Jaden Daniels or even a JJ McCarthy can compete with the rest of this division? It's going to be very interesting. I like the moves they made. They got a lot of things going for them. But if you guys enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.